Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in the question and answer for the Mike Dolinsky Stuff You Should Know webinars. So if you haven't had a chance to view the content of the two pre-recorded webinars, those will stay up for a while. So don't fear, you can go back and watch again for some time here. But we wanted to bring Mike on and give everybody the opportunity to ask some questions and engage and come at this conversation with the background of having watched his presentations. And so we're really looking forward to it. I've got some questions that have come in pre-asked, and we'll try and get through a few of those. And then we absolutely want to encourage any of you on the call to unmute and ask your questions verbally. And in all, we're just hoping to have some good conversation. So how are you today, Mike? I'm
doing just fine here. It's pretty cold up here in the far north in Edmonton. Yeah, just like Saskatoon, Regina, and Winnipeg. It's no different anywhere else.
Yeah, it seems like everybody is in the deep freeze, but hopefully for not too much longer.
No, I hope so. It looks like it's going to hang in here till at least the middle of next week, but eventually it'll go away. But we'll get going, I guess, eh?
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for doing this for us. I think it was a nice change of pace in terms of the kinds of content that we bring. We're usually so focused on water, and it was really interesting to take a step back and think about it from the plant's perspective and the plant processes. So thank you.
Well, I just want to make a comment before we get going. There was one gentleman who claimed to be elderly. Well, that's a claim. I'm consider myself elderly too. I'm a 73. If people were wondering what I'm still doing in this kind of work, but he said it's pretty deep dive and was you needed a Coles Notes sort of addition to this, and I hope he's on because he asked some really good questions. Yeah. And I just want people who are on this and who look at this presentation I put together, which was a real strain because doing these webinars is very difficult for me. It's much easier to do a live presentation. But I don't feel that at this stage I'm going to talk about the same thing that farmers have been hearing for the last 30 years. If you're still stuck in figuring out NPK, well, you're going to have to figure it out. But we've talked about that for 50 years because I've been now in this business for 49 years since I started professional work in Edmonton with Alberta Ag. And I never was in soils, so I didn't get into this until I was retired. I retired at the age of 56 and joined Agritren, and then I got into to fertility and so on through my photographs and looking at sex in wheat and roots and all that kind of stuff. And I've noticed by going through all those years when I used to travel with all the soil scientists and so on, and they're talking about these same issues we're still talking about today, 50 years later. So I decided that I can't do that. I don't want to do that. And because I have a biological background, that I would take a different view and look at plant physiology and try to tie the plants in and look at it from the plant's perspective. So that's what my role will be. I mean, I'm not what I would call an agronomist. I'm more of a plant guy and a physiologist. And it's true, what I did in that hour and a half the first day and then about 40 minutes the next day is probably for some of the recent graduates, the whole course in plant physiology touched on in that 2.5 hours. So it's not surprising if you found that tough to deal with, to tell you honest truth. But I can also tell you that when I started this about 8-9 years ago, I didn't know any of this stuff. And I learned it. And the first time I read it, I was talking to my wife about this yesterday, I couldn't figure out heads or tails because I couldn't even understand the words that were used. So how can you understand something if you don't even know the definition of the word? So don't be frustrated by the fact that maybe you couldn't understand it. The reality is that, and I always comes down to, the plant knows what to do. 450 million years of working at it, let's put them in a position. So just listen to the plant. There's my speech for today. Okay, let's get on to questions.
Well,
All right. Did you
I
want
would
to
like
show
to
that stuff
touch
on your visuals?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more just while you're talking about that. In terms of, I mean, I think you're an awesome example for so many of us in terms of lifelong learning and how you can learn anything if you put your mind to it. And I just wanted to maybe ask you, how do you approach tackling a new subject like that?
Well, you know, it's a tough one because I'm fortunate enough that I have a lot of enthusiasm, and now that I'm retired, I have time, and I spend it reading. I read a lot, like every day. I read for 2-3 hours, and mostly scientific publications because that's what intrigues me. So my lifelong learning is I wanted to be a teacher when I was a young man, and I came to Alberta as the provincial entomologist, which was really an extension about adult education. And I have just continued that. Now, for me, the quantum leap from bugs into plant physiology was a microscope. So I have a microscope that's connected to the computer. So as I look at plants, and I must admit, I will tell you the honest truth because somebody said, be honest. The honest truth was I switched to what I do because there was money to be made at it. Okay, there's no money in speaking about bugs until there's an outbreak. The money in terms of agronomy is related to fertility and crops and growing a crop, whether it be peas, canola, or whatever. So that started me. And then when I started doing my looking at, and you saw some of those photographs I showed you of pollen on the stigma of a wheat plant. Wow, you'll never see that anywhere else. You know, when I split that wheat kernel that I show that was germinating, there's only one other picture like that on the internet, and mine is better than that. Those were the motivations that drove me to learn more and more and more. And farmers, and one of my final comments here, and I'm going to put right up front, I think farmers really like iron. They like tractors, they like machines, they like figuring out things like that. And they just sort of think that the plant is just going to grow. We're going to put some fertilizer down there and it's going to grow. And you know, that isn't the reality that's going on. And that's what drives me to do this, And I must also admit, because they want me to be honest, for guys that are probably 55 to 60 years of age, you're going to have trouble learning this stuff if you want to learn it. And I recognize that. But my objective is not to change you, because if you aren't prepared to adopt at that age in your farming career, I'm not going to change that. I'm hoping to get young folks that are beginning agriculture, working with their dads or not, to pick this stuff up so they don't have to wait till, you know, I was 60, 65 before I started learning this, and I should have known this because I took it back in university. As soon as I left university, or the next day after I wrote the exam, I forgot about it and didn't have any relationship to what it meant. So when I start talking about the things that I talked about to recent graduates even, oh yeah, I remember that, and I remember that, and I remember that. But now they're in the industry, they're working around the clock, and they're not keeping up. To tell you the honest truth, they're not keeping up. And the government people are in the same boat. So that's what drives me.
Yeah. I mean, that's really powerful. I think, I guess one of the frustrations that I sometimes have, and I'm sure many others do too, is when you have a question and you go into, you know, maybe it's the literature, maybe it's just a search engine.
Mm-hmm.
How do you evaluate the quality of a source? How do you know what to trust? Where in the world, you know, do you draw the lines at North America or the Northern Great Plains, or, you know, how do you kind of evaluate sources of information?
Well, I mean, that's always a tough one, because even if you go to the literature, you'll find contradictions. It's a tough one. It's a tough one to figure that out. I don't basically do much work that's older, look at stuff that's older than about 2000, because almost all the research now today is all about genetics, proteomics, metabolomics, and breeding. The world is pinning a lot of hope on breeding for salinity resistance, breeding for heat tolerance, trying to breed C4 genetics or C4 processes like in corn into C3 plants to make them more efficient. Utilization of endophytes to fix nitrogen in plants and free living rhizobium that will fix nitrogen in plants. So there's been a huge shift in terms of focus. There isn't as much work done in the field anymore. It's all done in the lab. So when we start going to the field, it's kind of tough. And a lot of the stuff I read coming out of especially China, the Chinese have been trained all over the world and now are really, really good at doing that detailed stuff on genetics and how plants grow. And they've got huge, huge issues in terms of growing crops with a massive population. So they're spending a lot of time on this. So, I guess I look at reading a whole bunch of stuff and I have files that are just massive. And if I hear the story over and over and over in various places, that gives me some confidence, but not always, because what we do in reality is we tell a story. And if you tell the story enough to enough people, it becomes like a true belief. And that could be false. That could be false. So I don't have a good answer for you. I look at reviews because you can, and anybody can go on the internet and you want to find, like I'm working on potassium in my next presentation. Well, I can go on the internet and I can find a recent review on, potassium, the role of potassium in plants. Anybody can do that. And you can start reading about it. So I'll leave it with this. I've learned over time that the harder you look, the more you find. And this is one of my key messages. There was a question that was asked is, what are 3 strategies that you could use to nullify stress as much as possible? And I'll give you the one is spend time in your field with your plants with a shovel. With a shovel. That's your best tool to use because the plants will tell you. But if you never spend time looking at your plants, you never spend time looking at your roots. Remember what I said, you've got the source and the sink. The sink are the roots most of the time until the plant is going to senesce, then the roots will give it all up to the shoot. That relationship is going to, if you just think about that, if your shoot looks awful, then you better look at your roots because it may be feeding your roots because your roots are dying. Your roots are not getting nutrients. Your roots are not getting water and there's not much you can do. So that's your first thing is put your shadow in the field a lot. Don't drive into the driveway like the road entrance and walk into the field and put your hand out and say, hey, this crop looks pretty good. Well, yeah, right. That crop looks pretty good. And then when, you harvest it, you're wondering, well, what the heck happened? There was all kinds of straw there. Look back at it. But if you're not in the field on a regular basis, and if you're not taking soil samples and tissue samples, I don't even know how you farm, if you want to be honest.
Yeah.
How can you put together a fertility program on a field if you don't even know where you're starting? I'm amazed at farmers. I am truly amazed at how successful they are. We got great land, but you also saw what I brought up. We are sucking on that land faster than we have ever sucked by the yields we're producing in today's environment. And eventually, if we don't keep up with what is leaving the soil, we will run out of it. Civilizations have ended because of that strategy. This is only 100 years that we've been farming this land here. Look at China. Look at the Middle East, 10,000 years they've been farming that land and it's pretty well depleted. Zinc deficiencies are globally an issue. Vitamin A is an issue. All these come from plants. Anyhow, enough philosophy for today. Let's get on to some questions.
Oh, that's awesome, Mike. I'm sure we'll come back to your shadow on the field stuff. And I just want to reiterate, the 2 things that I really took as a resource newer than the year 2000, and that you really rely on reviews, you know, instead of trying to look at a bunch of single studies, go in and find a good review on a subject. If
you're right, the single studies will be so deep, you'll go into that rabbit hole and you'll come out the other end not figuring out what. Many of the reviews that are on topics you can find out are put a little bit more in layman's language, for lack of a better term. They're just sort of made easy. And you know, be careful also. When you go into internet, everything is there. You look at old publications you bring up on there that are, you know, 20, 30 years old. That stuff is obsolete, man, in a general sense. Yeah. You know, so sort of be careful on reading old stuff. I mean, some of it is credible, but a lot of it is not valid today.
Beautiful. Well, I would like to take a minute to share a couple of things that I put together after recording our conversations. I found it really interesting. You guys are seeing my screen, correct?
Yep, I can.
So you brought up this infographic related to time of day and the plant processes and the stomatal openings. And I found it really interesting to look at this alongside our soil moisture data. And we've talked about this, you know, since we first started with our soil moisture probes, is really understanding why we see the stair-stepping pattern in our soil moisture graph, and that daytime use of water and then the stomatal closing and not so much use overnight where it levels off, and then heavy use again during the day. And then we've had a consultant that we work with out of the Milestone area has put out some time-lapse cameras on a couple of his weather stations. And I really wanted to share with you guys some of these images. So this is the same field, the same spot over a few days that were pretty warm days. And this is the canola field at 9 o'clock at night. And 9 o'clock in the morning, as we ramp up on a pretty hot day and then back down. And it is pretty incredible to see how this plant reacts and moves throughout the day to the temperature and the conditions. So I don't know if you had any comments on that, Mike?
I would. You notice that the plants move. Almost all movement in plants is done by hydraulic pressure that we call osmotic pressure, because for those leaves to fold up, something has to happen. And potassium is one of the key nutrients in that process, as we pointed out, as well as opening and closing the stomata. But almost all of that is related to potassium and hydraulic osmotic pressures in the plants.
So overcoming that heat stress, like is the plant recovering at night? Is that part of the?
I'm not sure what that, I've never seen this actually before. I mean, when you get those leaves turning on canola, when you're driving down the road towards evening and times, and they're sort of tilting over, that's a way to deal with reducing the exposure of the sunshine on the leaf. And then when they wilt towards evening, you'll notice in the morning, they're all puffed up again, because that's hydraulic pressure in the roots at night. That is, even though the stomata are closed, the pressure is still moving up in there, so that it actually moves that water up into that tissue and fills it up again. And then during the daytime, it's ready to go in the morning. And canola is the most amazing plant we have. It's the best weed crop. It can extract phosphorus better than anything else we got. It puts its roots up in that upper horizon, its big roots. And it is a great crop, man. Oh man, it is a great crop. It was a boon to, yeah, you can, it's hard to see this in many plants, but you see how this leaf here, for example, you can't see my, you know, when you see that silver look and the leaf is turned up and you see the bottom of the leaf, you know, there was a question, how can you tell a plant is under stress? Well, there's one clue. And if you see that for too many days, then you know that plant is pretty well running out of water during the daytime and it's filling up at night. Good photographs, yeah. This I've never seen. I've seen, if you guys have ever had lodging, and you'll notice that the plants lodge and then they turn up. They turn up at the node and they grow differentially at the node. And that is also, the plant knows which way is up. So it has carbohydrate sugar granules that fall, because you take a tree, it can be on a side of a mountain and it grows vertically. So it knows by gravitation which way is directly up. And the same with all of these plants. So when a plant lodges, it'll turn up by differentially growing it, because and putting pressure on one side of the node to push that head up towards sunlight. So it's an interesting, it's like a muscle that pulls it up. But this is really cool. I don't think anybody's been out photographing plants in the middle of the night, to tell you honest truth. And I'm not sure what the behavior is, but go ahead, next.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a neat image and so powerful to see. I mean, we think of plants as really inert and just there and taking what they get, and you see how they're using the resources and protecting itself, or recovering, or just setting itself up for the next day, right?
Yep. It's like us.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like us going to bed. It's like us going to bed. That's when our mind is cleansed and we're rejuvenated. That's the same time that these guys are. But remember that during the night, the plant has to use some of the sugar it produced during the daytime in respiration to stay alive. So if you get long periods where it's really cold, where it's cloudy during the daytime, long periods of rain, if the plant doesn't produce enough sugar during the daytime to cover it through the night, the plant stalls, or in fact goes backwards. So if it can't get water during the daytime enough to open the stomata to allow CO2 in, because it's too darn dry, that plant will actually stall or go backwards. And that's why sometimes you'll see them just not making any progress at all.
Yeah.
There's a good reason for that. That water CO2 issue is a real problem for us on the prairies, and always has been. And the plants have mechanisms to deal with it to a point. And one of those is that night movement to water in when it's cooler and the plant is cool, because the plant uses the water to cool itself too. So when you have that stomata closed and it's hot and sunny out there, it is actually just like us, you would be cooking out there, because the loss of water actually cools you, just like a sweating is in. Plants aren't much different than us. Same amino acids, the whole works, eh? And
yeah.
the only things we got a mind, which really confuses us. They don't have a mind. They just respond to the environment. They're much smarter than we are.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of speaks right into the next point is, that heat on its own, and those images that we saw, that soil was still pretty full. There was a lot of water in the soil profile to help manage that heat stress. And this is just a field that I was in a few times, and kind of looking at the environmental sensor data off of our stations to start to quantify some of that heat stress. And, noticing that there wasn't a huge amount of heat days prior to pod fill, but also, correlating it with heat and the dry topsoil, where they're probably really struggling to manage that heat stress. So the correlation of similar times and really the 11 days of heat during pod fill, all of which were under drought stress as well, probably had a much bigger impact. So the days in vegetative stage above 29, and then here as we started into flowering, and then so many of them through the pod fill when the 10 and 20 were completely at wilting point.
Yeah. The pod fill and the seed fill in wheat. The general rule, I'm more familiar with wheat because when I started in this business, Phil Thomas was around, so he was the canola guy, and I decided I would be the wheat guy. With wheat, for example, once you get through that peak I talk about and you get into reproduction, you need about 1/3 of your water after anthesis. Because and I'll go through this, and I mentioned it before, but there's a question about protein later that we'll address. When the kernel is pollinated, or the seed is pollinated, the ovaries pollinated, that first 7-8 days is just accumulating stuff. Well, and building what are the amyloplasts to store all that starch. So you need moisture and movement to move nutrients up into the plant, because those are coming from the leaves down below. That's where the sugars and so on are. The head is very poor at photosynthesizing, and the stem and so on. So you got to have water. If you don't have water and everything is shut down, nothing is moving. So that period of filling is much more critical than we like to believe when it's under drought stress. When it's not under drought stress, well, you've got lots of water. And as I said, we have plants here. All of our plants except the perennials have a 90 to 120 day life cycle, which is equivalent to human being, lifetime kind of thing. So it's got to, and it's programmed to die. So the plant knows it's going to die when it goes into bloom. So, and it's programmed, as cellular plant death is going on. So it has to move. It's already programmed to move everything out of its stems, its roots, into that seed head to put out the next progeny. And it starts with the roots. So in the beginning, just after pollination, the roots are still pulling nutrients. And I just quickly looked at this stuff this morning that you sent, and we'll get to it in a minute. It's pulling nutrients from both the leaves, which are the source, and the roots. And then as time goes on, there's less and less from the roots. So you got to get that nutrient moved in there quickly. And that's why I said those first, there's usually 3 to 4 seeds in that, there we go, in that spikelet. Those first 2 at the bottom here, these 2, are the ones that they get the nutrients first, because that's still early on in terms of the senescing of the plant and killing of it to move those nutrients up. Just that simple. It's not brain surgery. You can read that anywhere you want, but it won't be put in those simple terms.
No, well, I mean, I think that rolls into one of our participant questions really well. So he's asking about the difference in seed vigor, and you talked about it in relations to nutrients by the seed. He asked, has there been any difference in seed or plant health and use of nutrients when the wheat seed is high in protein, 15.5 versus 12% protein? So I'm taking it that he's got two options for seed, and both have good vigor. Which of those?
Well, if they're both the same with both good vigor, then yeah, the protein is of some value. Now we're just starting on that trail where we're doing this 100 samples of wheat, and we're going to be taking a look at all of those factors as best we can. But I would also say that if you have the same kind of growing conditions, the same nutrient package there, then the one with the higher protein would be of some benefit. But if your protein is high because you were droughted, that may not be the case. Because what that tells you, if your protein is high, that when you get a drought, you get high protein wheat. It's just the way it is, because you got more nitrogen there than the plant needs. So you get excess nitrogen going into the seed. Doesn't mean you got the rest of the nutrients going into the seed, because it was probably drier than the dickens some period during that plant's life. So that's why I'm looking at this whole nutrient package relative to those kind of issues. But if you had 15.5, 16, 17.5%, but you had great growing conditions, that's a whole different package than that protein that is in wheat that was done under drought, as far as I'm concerned, because there's a good chance you got lots of protein, but you might not have the nutrient package with the rest of the micros and macros that you need for good germination and vigor. That's
great point, Mike. Yeah. So when you guys are doing this test, are you also tracking 1,000 kernel weight to see if there's any correlation between nutrient density? Or
we can do that because we've got a reserve of everyone. The lab keeps a sample of everything. So once we get the nutrient evaluation done in it, we will then go back and take a look at it and try and correlate things. And then, of course, for guys, it's clear that I work part-time as a contractor with Taurus, and we have nutrients that we supply, and I'd rather not talk about those so I don't compromise myself. But we will be then looking at, if we have some nutrient deficiencies, can we in fact enhance that in the seed by applying nutrient packages to the seed and compensate for those lacks, if we know which ones are the key ones. Now, for you guys that use your own seed, and I've preached this for years, and some of you maybe have heard me say, become your own seed grower if you're not going to buy, registered seed. That means pick the field you want as your seed field, treat it really, really well, maybe put on a couple of fertilizer packages, fungicides, and then when you get it, clean it down, take out 50% and sell it to somebody, and then use the remaining parts, your big seed. You'll be seeding at 3.5, 4 bushels an acre with that big seed, but that'll give you potentially a big boost. It's a very controversial issue. Is big seed better than small? I'm saying, yes, you try and find data, and it's really, really tough to find consistent data. It's really, really tough to find consistent data in the field, period, because every year is different. Every year is blasted different. So you try and repeat something. One year you're going to get a benefit from something because of the conditions. The next year you may not get a benefit. If you have a good, supply of nutrients in your soil and you put on something, and we'll talk about foliars here in a minute, put on something, you may not get a benefit one year, but if it's under stress and so on the next year, you could get a benefit. You can't guarantee that. There's no way you can guarantee, because you guys are doing the great job of trying to work with water. Finally, perhaps the most important nutrient we have is water on the prairies. And the biggest boon to agriculture has been conservation of moisture on the prairies. I remember 50 years ago when I came here, we didn't grow canola in southern Alberta and most of southern Saskatchewan because it was too dry. We didn't have varieties that could handle it. We were growing Rapa varieties, the old Polish types. Couldn't take that heat at all. Now it's a monster crop. We were growing 5 million, 4 million acres. Now we're growing 20, 22 million acres across all kinds of environments, primarily because of minimum tillage, conservation of moisture, and hybrid varieties. That's how we've gotten here. The question is, what's the next big quantum leap that we got to get over? And we're depending a lot on genetics, man. And better use, water utilization, and nutrient efficiency. And we're going to be swamped with all kinds of microbes coming at us over the next few years that are supposedly going to help us. And they will. How did I get here?
I don't know. We've got another question from Carter. He asks, speaking of protein in wheat, between sulfur and nitrogen in relation to cysteine and methionine, how does that equate into protein and yield?
Well, that question came up in terms of why is methionine the start of the protein development. Well, we got two amino acids that contain sulfur, and the one that is actually, first of all, let me go back because I don't know if you understand, folks understand this. There are two nutrients that plants take up that have to be changed before they can use them, and those are nitrate and sulfate. The plant cannot use nitrate and it can't use sulfate. Both of them have to be reduced, and in that process, we sort of acidify soil, so that's a good thing. So, and we need a blend of both because those two amino acids, methionine and cysteine, have to be blended with all the other 18 in order to make a full protein. So if you're deficient in sulfur, and that's why we use different ratios. I assume we're going at ratios. We know that canola, for example, uses more sulfur, so we use generally ratio at 6:1 or so, 7:1. Wheat doesn't have as much protein in it, so we don't need quite as much, but we need that ratio to be about the same. So, the sulfur is key because without the sulfur balancing that nitrogen, we can't produce efficiently the full complement of amino acids. kind of that. I mean, the sulfur is used in my presentation. The glutathione is what is circulated in the plant for the plant to measure what the sulfur level is in the plant. And that's key because in terms of a stress response, it's the sulfur, the glutathione that comes to the rescue along with vitamin A and scavenging all those free radicals. So sulfur to me is really key. You know, in simplistic terms, when we talk about fertility in plants, I'm a firm believer in this. There's a good reason why we put on N, P, K, and S. Because when you look at it in the plant, they use lots of it. When a plant uses a lot of it, that should be your clue that you don't ever want to run out of those, because that's what builds the plant. So, you know, N and P, that's in your DNA, all your amino acids. Like, holy smokes, you know, all the plasma membrane is hooked to phosphorus. The ATP is running on phosphorus. You never want the plant to be deficient in phosphorus or not able to get sulfur or any of these, the big ones. After you get that worked out, then you kind of work on the other ones, the calcium and so on, and the micros is still my philosophy. Those big ones are big. That's why they've been used. The trouble is, a lot of people are still looking at it that way. NPK and S, maybe S. I think S has become more prevalent of late because we've cleaned up our atmosphere. The whole world is now, or at least the northern developed world, is now short of sulfur in their crops when, you know, 20 years ago we had acid rain. So now we're fixing that problem. But how about the micros? You know, I'm a sort of fan of micros because we've been farming here 100 years. We didn't even start fertilizing until really effectively 50 years ago. And we haven't even started fertilizing for micros on the prairies.
Yeah, that sulfur example is a really good like hint. It's the canary in the coal mine of how quickly the things can change. And yeah, we haven't had to think about those things to grow our crops in the past, but that isn't necessarily going to be true going forward.
Going forward, yes. I mean, and you want the balance. It's always about homeostasis. Remember that word. If you go to the literature today and you read anything that's being published, that word will show up in that literature. I guarantee you it will show up in that literature, because we finally realized that just putting on more N or more P does not solve our problems in the long run. And one of the best examples when we had Ken King on, you know, 87 bushels in that 100 bushel canola contest. He had a phosphorus level of 190 parts per million, 190. And he couldn't get over 88 with 6.9% organic matter in some of the best land in that Three Hills area in the country. That tells you something, that this is not an easy task. Other guys are getting 100, and most farmers, when they run across their fields, get 100 bushels somewhere on that field. You know, when you're out there, stop and take a look at the plants. Stop and maybe mark it or GPS it and take a soil sample there. Find out why that's happening there. You'll learn a heck of a lot with a shovel and taking a soil sample and a tissue sample from there, and it'll tell you why that is producing. And I'll just about guarantee you that one of the big factors will be potassium. An excessive amount of potassium there will probably be one of the nutrients that is giving you that response. Just that simple. Learn from yourself. You guys have the opportunity to learn on your own land. You know your land best. Take a tissue sample, take a soil sample. You will learn more than you ever wanted to. In fact, you may not want to know that. I always worry about guys who won't leave a check strip. It's as though they don't want to know whether they made a mistake in what they've done. They'd sooner just do it all. That's the only way you're going to learn. Do it on your own land. Gee, I'm sounding like a preacher now, man. Anyhow.
No, I mean, I think it's really, sometimes it's hard to we get really caught up in the busyness of the season and forget that we get one chance every year to learn something. And it's not that you're going to learn it all, but but we should try and learn something every year.
You know what, if you can't get it done on your own farm because you're too busy and whatever, and you haven't got a son or a wife that wants to do this, hire a really good agronomist. When you're sick, you don't go and ask the welder down at the shop what to do. You go to the doctor, and the same darn thing is here. Go to somebody who works in this. Well, take the soil sample properly. Most guys don't even take the soil sample properly. So if you don't get the sample done properly, potentially, the end result isn't worth a hoot. I mean, you gotta take a look at this in a serious way. Farming is not a hobby anymore. Farming is a scientific venture. Look at it that way. This is science nowadays about how this is done. We know a lot about these plants. We know a lot about nutrition, how they deal with. But if you don't use it, and that's the other reason I do this, this stuff I talk about in the plant physiology stuff never gets down into the agricultural side of it. We're not even utilizing what information we already have, and we're generating more. We're still working on stuff that's from 20 and 30 years ago. And we haven't even adopted some of the current stuff. Look what's happened with changing in plant populations with canola. We used to do, 5 pounds, period, 5 pounds, 5 pounds, regardless. Now we're talking about 5 plants per square foot with these hybrids compared to 10 or 15. Things are changing, and there's sort of reasons for that. And still people are not moving forward in terms of adopting some of these changes. And I suggest to anybody, don't adopt them holus bolus. Try it.
So you got to say that again, holus bolus?
Yes, holus bolus. That must be old terminology. Yeah, do not accept that. Do it on your own farm. Most of you guys can shut off and put on your seeding apparatus nowadays. Just shut it off for a little while, for a couple of feet or a couple of yards, and find out what that means. You'll learn a lot about that. Be explorative in your aging years or your farming years, and don't look at your neighbor's field across the road and said, well, I don't know why he's got such a good crop. Go and watch him. Go to the best farmers in the country and ask them what they're doing. They may not tell you, but they're doing something. Hire the best agronomist you can afford if you can't do it yourself. And it pays. And, Kendall's an example. I did her opening meeting when she was becoming an agro coach in the old AgroTrend days. Those guys and women made their clients nothing but money as far as I'm concerned. And when you're farming, I know you're always concerned, and it's easy for me to say, I know you're going to say that, concerned about saving money. Well, we concluded you can't save your way to a good crop. The question is in terms of a good agronomist, is what does this cost, is the wrong question. But that's always the question we ask, and that's just human nature. The question is how much are you going to make me? How much are you going to help me in terms of my decision making on my farm? Okay, next.
That's awesome. So do you want to tackle the question about foliars, Mike?
Oh, foliars. I have a simple solution or way I look at foliars. Foliars are not a fertility program. Foliars are a short-term stopgap supplement to a good fertility package. If you start out with a poor fertility package, I don't think foliars are going to help you. You can do a lot with certain ones, like nitrogen you can apply anytime. That's no problem. Maybe people don't realize that boron you can apply anytime. That's no problem. But things like phosphorus and potassium, which don't move a whole lot in the soil, and you can't get tremendous amounts, and the plant uses lots of it. You can't get enough on and into the plant in most cases to be beneficial. You can get some on with foliars. They'll take in some. Things like urea go in very easily because it's a non-charged molecule, so ion, so it'll be sucked in. But many of them won't. So here's the way I look at foliars. Foliars are good for maybe, depending on which one and how much, a week, 10 days, maybe, depending on the conditions. And what I believe foliars do is they trick the plant into thinking they've got more nutrient than they do. Because if they're struggling, it's more or less a stress management or deficiency. And here's the trick. Almost all the labels will say used based on a tissue test. Well, if you're not doing a tissue test, then how do you know what nutrients your plants are short of and which product that has those nutrients to apply and how much of that nutrient that you need is necessary to cause a response in the plant? So you got to make those decisions. But what it does logically is if the plant, what it does is it grows more roots, is my perspective. The roots, the part near the tip is where most of the absorption takes place, because right behind that growing tip is where you have the young root hairs that are then emerging. And it's by going through the soil that it's exposed to new areas of nutrient and potentially water, depending on how much water you've sucked out of that profile already. So what you get done is the plant moving some roots, growing some root hairs a little bit longer, which is important with a nutrient that doesn't move towards the, in the mass flow. So you'll grow some root hairs, because if you don't grow any new tissue, and primarily root hairs, in a week, that plant's in the same boat it was unless it rains a lot, if it's dry, if it's a dry condition, or if it's nutrient deficient. So to me, that's a stopgap in a key time to fill a gap that the roots basically can't fill because it gets dry or it gets too hot, something like that. That's how I look at foliars. They're great, but if you don't know what you're short of, hard to figure out. Then I'm going to tell you that one story. What time is it here?
You got lots of time. Don't worry.
I changed just as an example. I was doing some boron work here because I'll answer that boron question right now. There's a boron question. What to do about boron?
Yeah. Tissues are always low. By adding boron at herbicide and fungicide timing, is that going to be worthwhile? Okay.
I have another philosophy. Remind me where the heck I was going here. So I got off the path here on Chris. So I was doing boron work, and here's what I did. I applied 5 pounds of granular boron and 10 pounds of granular boron on canola the day after it was seeded. I wanted to see if I could fix the boron issue. And I won't get into the story, and I did, and I figured but the most you can pump up boron is about 60 parts per million. The plant will shut down uptake after that point in time. With boron, I would say if you are consistently finding boron deficiency, fix the problem by broadcasting 1, 2, 3 pounds of boron on the surface of the soil. Just that easy. Just that easy. To me, trying to putz around, that's maybe another old term, putz around, with putting on a few grams at various times is a stopgap because it turned too dry for the roots to get it. And the reason you can do that with things like boron is because it's an anion. Okay, for some folks who maybe don't understand this, and I don't know where everybody is, the soil is negatively charged. So when you put a negatively charged material into the soil environment, it doesn't attach to the cation exchange sites very well. And as a result, the water will move it down into the rooting zone. So you can simply just broadcast it on in the springtime. You can even broadcast it on after you seed it and let it wash into the soil profile, and the roots will find it, and you solve your problem for the year. Just that easy. Just that easy. The other option that works, and Chris, this guy I work with, he put on 1 pound of boron in a foliar with 40 pounds of nitrogen and 5 pounds of sulfur because he knew he had to supplement that, and he planned on that. He's got 2 high.
So that would have been a top dress, Mike, not
yes, it was a streamer, stream top. So we did that, and we drove the parts per million up to 60 parts per million with that application. was adequate for the summer. Get it out, because if you're going to wait until you're later in the season, the root hairs need it. Everything needs the boron throughout its growing cycle. So if you're short late, my thesis is you're short early. So why horse around with it as far as I'm concerned if you've got a problem? And then you tissue test. You put it on, you wait a couple of weeks, you tissue test. If you're still short because you didn't put enough on or you got stranded in some fashion, then you can use foliars to supplement that. But you're depending on the root system to do that for you. On the whole is how I would handle that.
Yeah, so, and if you're seeing a deficiency when you're taking a tissue at peak vegetation and your roots are already fairly extensive, certainly you're probably seeing
you're already behind the 8 ball. You won't catch up very easily. You can get boron in pretty quickly. It goes in foliar. I know that for sure, man. It goes in foliarly, but it doesn't move a whole lot once it's inside the plant, but you know, you've got some slides that you're going to show in a little while here that I want to make a point on boron. But go back to, so that's how I would handle boron. And guys in Southern Alberta that I've worked with for years are finally listening, and they're putting on a couple of pounds of boron and solving the problem. It's just like copper. You know what? A foliar treatment is not going to fix a problem more than for a little while. If you want to fix it, put it in the ground in enough there to build that, just like you would a phosphorus. Southern Saskatchewan is deficient in zinc, big time. If you're growing durum wheat, which is the poor scavenger of zinc, you will not likely fix it with a foliar zinc, in my opinion. You need to get enough in the soil that the roots are going to pick it up. It doesn't need a lot. It doesn't need a lot. So make sure you follow those labels. It doesn't need a lot of boron. And I should clear up the boron issue. Everybody says boron is toxic. It sure as heck is. If you put boron, I would never put boron granules in the seed row. Never. I've done that with my lab here down in the basement. And it does kill plants. But if you put it on the surface, when it diffuses down through that soil profile, it gets tied up in some of that organic matter, some of the soil, and the roots find it and everybody's happy. And you got it dispersed throughout the rooting zone, which is only about 10 inches. The majority of the roots are in the top 10 inches because there's nothing much down below that in terms of a mix of nutrients. And if it's going down for water. And you notice in your water profiles, when you get rain, all of a sudden the uptake is up higher in the profile. Well, yeah, because the plant is now able to, because the volume is there to get it to percolate even through its cuticle, and it'll put out more lateral roots in response to that moisture. But back to the tissue test. One tissue test changed this farmer's whole perspective on farming. I took that tissue test when I was doing this boron stuff, and I had my check, which was untreated. And the zinc was in the toilet, not the zinc, the boron was in the toilet, the potassium was in the toilet, and he then put on all that boron and so on after that. But he thought he had been doing a good job. He thought he was putting on a little bit of potassium, a little bit, and he changed his whole perspective on farming with his son that's coming into the business, and they've decided they're not going to buy any more land. What they're going to do is they're going to improve the productivity of that land. And he already has done a bunch of grid sampling, and he has applied limestone because he's got a pH that's about 5.5. So that's what you learn from a tissue test. It's like a blood test in a human being, just that easy. And I think you'll learn more from that combined with the soil test. And now, as I mentioned, we're going to start looking at the nutrient in the seed and let the plant tell you what it was missing. Next.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about that data stacking in terms of your tissue samples and the what you can learn from the conditions that are in the field at the time of the sample. And that's something that, you know, from the first time Elston did your tissue sampling 10-step course or whatever, that's his first questions. You need your crop stage. You need to know what the conditions are in the field. And we're starting with our crop intelligence, with our environmental sensors and our soil moisture data. We can bring a whole nother layer of context to those tissue samples. So, looking at this early, when you've got less than 6 millimeters of rain in the last 7 days, and we've had hardly anything since seeding, it's no surprise that you see a few more issues in an early season tissue. Versus when your root mass starts to increase and your new tissues start to kind of rectify the problems a little bit, you're still seeing some stuff in the old tissues.
Let me just go back to that one. Where's take a look here. Old tissue, new tissue. I've been doing this kind of work here, wondering about, movement of nutrients. Notice how the boron levels are higher, the zinc levels are higher, the manganese are evidence of the start of flowering. So it's still not, gone over the hump. The copper levels are higher. It's all moving up into the newer tissues, because the newer tissues are where the plant can move stuff. And you look at, they say, copper is immobile in the plant once it gets established. You bet your butt it is. When that plant is moving nutrients and it's destroying some bottom leaves, it is. And also when it's taking up nutrients, it will preferentially move those nutrients to the new tissue. Why the heck is it going to put more copper or any of these in older tissue, which are primarily, all of these are used for enzyme processes and photosynthesis? Manganese, iron, copper, zinc are all photosynthetic issues in terms of behavior in the plant. So the plant is not going to load up the old stuff. It's going to eventually move it. It's going to move it into the new growing parts, and that's where you need some water. That's not, that's not brain surgery.
No. And just, like you say, starting to put in those nutrient uptake pathways. Where's the soil, water, where are the roots, and starting to layer that with where the nutrients are in the profile as well.
Go back to that one. That one's key. Look at this. This is at 50% bloom now. What is Marshner? Well, you guys don't know Marshner, but what did you say? The reproductive parts need more nutrients than the vegetative parts. And this is a perfect example, because I've done this summer several times, and this is exactly what happens. Look at this. And I was taking the buds, the flower buds. And you know what? This one here has moved the boron into where it needs to be. Not so much zinc at this one, manganese. It's moved the copper where it needs to be. So this boron here, what I find is I don't take the leaves in the upper part of the plant. I take the buds. When I'm going into this flowering part, and I do it earlier, and I see this all the time, that the plant moves that boron into the buds, because that's where the heck it needs it, eh?
We had a question about your tissues from Braden. He asks, tissues top, middle, bottom. Any theory why why the sodium was so high in the old tissue?
No, I don't. Well, the only thing I can say is the bloody plant left it behind because it didn't want it. Additionally, we had a lot of moisture this spring when the plants were younger and growing. So I think they were forced, they were taking up a lot of bad stuff. They were under a tremendous amount of stress. I noticed that as well, Braden, and I'm not sure why, because the sodium levels aren't very high, but they were high. I haven't got a good explanation why it picked up so much, other than they were just, some of them, and I don't know what the underground water was like, and the deeper, we didn't have soil tests in that darn field because it was a strip trial. But we might have had, because a lot of the low spots were flooded, we might have had a lot of sodium in the deeper water that was moving around this year, brought it up closer to the surface. I don't have a good answer.
This is shifting gears a little bit, but we had a trend that we were seeing on a few of our pulse crops on tissue samples with low manganese, and something that we don't typically think about in terms of an issue on our soil tests, but seeing it on those pulse crops. Any thoughts regarding that, Mike?
Well, you mentioned that your pHs are 7.5 and 8. Well, at those pHs, manganese, you say you didn't used to see that?
Well, just not, I mean, it's not something you pick up on any of our soil tests. Don't show that that would be something to even think about, right? But
well, I'm not sure, but the one thing I know for sure is that of all the new micros and nutrients, manganese is the least mobile once it's set in the plant. In other words, even when the plant is destroying leaves to move nutrients, it will not move manganese. It has to come up the plant in the root and the water flow, the xylem tissue in the transpiration flow. That is the one nutrient along with calcium that it does not move once it's set in. So I would think that if you were seeing that, it might have been because there was no transpiration worth a hoot during that period of time. If that was, during that pod filling time and stuff like that, and it dried her out, man, yeah, manganese, I would suspect would be deficient, just like boron. A lot of times in canola, we will see boron deficiency late in the season because it's drying up. Remember this, an anion moves with water. All those negative charged ones will move with the water because it's not tightly attached to the cation exchange sites. So when it gets dry, any of those anions are not going to move if the plant is not transpiring and pulling new water and nutrients into the system. Plants drink, they don't eat. That's the secret to it.
Beautiful. Do you want to move on to some of the next questions? Oh, do you want to talk about regenerative ag, Mike?
Oh, heck of a good idea. It's a great marketing plan. I think it's great. It's like organic. It's a way to produce a product you can build a story around. And the consumer is looking for a story. And regenerative agriculture is a great idea. I mean, for many people, we know that having a continuous rooting system in the soil is a great thing to reduce erosion, to actually transfer nutrients from plants to plants. We know that mycorrhizae will move and infect more than one plant and move nutrients in between those plants. It's a great concept. It won't be maybe for everybody because of dry conditions, but they'll make that story. I think it's great. The issue of depleting nutrients is the same issue I think we have to a degree in depleting phosphorus in organic systems because we have very few ways to put it back and we don't have enough manure. So regenerative agriculture, I sit by, I'm a believer that the microbes are key, and you get that with a diverse rooting structure in there, that's for sure. Most of them include a livestock component, which then mixes that all in, and you don't really remove nutrients to a degree. There's various kinds of aspects to it, and I don't follow it closely. But you know what? As a farmer, anything you can do that partitions you from the commodity side of things probably gives you an advantage in the marketplace if you have the market. And that's what organic has done. They've developed the market, rightfully or wrongfully. And I always looked at it this way. I was the organic specialist for Alberta Ag for about 7 years. That was my retirement. I was the provincial organic specialist in retirement instead of the entomologist. So that was my reward for killing things all my life, rats and coyotes, and and then they made me the organic specialist. So I used this philosophy. People would say, well, organic's expensive, it's no better. And I said, you know what? People drive different cars. Some guys drive a Chevy, some drive a Cadillac. They feel good in it. And if I'm eating organic, perception is your reality. If I'm eating organic, and my mind says that I feel better because I'm eating organic, I'm eating organic. I'm healthier. It's just the way we perceive ourselves. So does it matter? I can afford it, whatever. So it's the same thing, I think, with regenerative. Now, whether it'll last depends on whether they can build a market for that product.
Yeah.
And I think from a soil microbe perspective, yeah, it's great. I think we're slowly coming around to the understanding that it is the root exudates of plants that are key to the viability of those microbes, because the microbes are after the same thing that the plants are, the sugar, because they can't get the carbon from the atmosphere any other way, just like we can't get the carbon from the atmosphere. We eat it in terms of those molecules with carbon in them. So to me, the best thing we can do for microbes is grow a big crop with good fertility, and that will help our microbes without being toxic to the microbes.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, it's one of those buzzwords, and when you simplify it to a marketing strategy, yeah, it's kind of interesting. So.
To me, it's great. Anything that we as farmers can do to diversify our market is a good strategy.
Yeah. We have a question from Mark. He says, how does a zinc deficient seed utilize a seed primer? Does the seminal root pull zinc from a seed primer through the soil, or is the zinc extracted through the seed surface?
I think it would be just a tiny bit of both. And I don't have any definite proof of that. And it would depend on whether it was a zinc sulfate potentially or a zinc oxide in terms of availability. Now you can see that when the root, the seminal roots start to come out, they have root hairs like right away. It's amazing, you know, in 3-4 days, they're sucking it up. So I think there's some could be going in with the imbibation of water when it's taking in water, depending if it's soluble, you know, a little bit soluble in there, it would be taken in, and then the roots would be picking it up right after. So I think it potentially is both.
So you mentioned sulfate and oxide. You're looking at a seed primer. Is there one that's preferable, or is it dependent?
The sulfates are generally much more available to the plant and are picked up a lot quicker, because the plant wants, you know, sulfur in some form, but it has to then reduce it in order to actually incorporate it. So I would say it's probably both, but you know, that's something we can potentially deal with, but I don't know if it really matters, because zinc is not mobile in the soil, and neither is phosphorus to a degree, and we're putting this into really, really cold soil. So the germination process takes much longer at that point in time. So probably doesn't matter which way it goes into, but you've got it right there for immediate pickup even afterwards.
Okay. We have another question from Chris, and he said, from a plant perspective, thoughts on Brix levels in the leaf. Do we want higher or lower during growth, and how does this change over the season?
It's another old term. Well, that Brix thing, eh? I haven't thought about it a whole lot, but you know, when we got a lot of sugar in the plant, it's a good thing if the sugar is moving. It's not so good if the sugar ain't moving. Okay, so it's a double-edged sword. If you have a lot of stress and you got a lot of sugar, then that's not a good thing. That's telling you the sugar isn't moving from the leaves and moving to the sinks. If you got good growing conditions, you've got a lot of sugar going on, that's a good thing, because now you know that sugar is being produced in photosynthesis. So I think it depends on the circumstances and the conditions under which you take that test. And that's the key point, is you will only probably develop that feel, because some of this is science and some of it's feel, is by doing it over a number of years and learning yourself. And I should point out, both whether you use Brix or you're going to use a tissue test, you just can't do it 1 year. If you're going to do it and you want to find out, and you're curious, or maybe you don't think you have to, just take one field. Take one field, make that your research part, and do it through 3 or 4 years with different crops under different circumstances in different locations. Your good land, you know, wherever you got good yield, your poor land, and then you'll know something. But if you do it 1 year and think that that's the answer, you're just wasting, you know, maybe your time. In that 1 year, you might do something, but you're not going to learn anything about how that soil responds under those various conditions on crops. They're going to respond totally different. For example, when you grow canola, canola is not support mycorrhizae. In other words, the crucifers and the chenopodiums, which are the pigweeds, do not have mycorrhizae. What does that mean? That means that they have no support from that fungal organization in the soil to help them. So they evolved over time with other strategies to extract primarily phosphorus. That's why canola is so good for us. But if you grow canola the following year, it's going to take quite a while longer for your soil to build up its mycorrhizal population again. So, that's why, and I'll tell you, Taurus, we sell mycorrhizae produced in Quebec here in Canada, the best in the world. Some of the best scientists in the world working on it here. And a lot of work has been done in Canada on mycorrhizae. So if you grow canola 2 years in a row, you really reduce the amount of mycorrhizae in that soil. But, so some of that kind of stuff, you don't even think about how that might be affecting it. So then you can go and repopulate that darn plant. But it's a great plant because it's got longer root hairs by almost double wheat, just naturally. And that gives it a tremendous amount of exposure in that rooting zone to extract nutrients that are immobile, like phosphorus, like metals, zinc, copper, and so on. That's why this crop is a miracle for us. You just thought it was your good farming skills, but it's really the plant that's making the difference.
Awesome.
Anything else?
Jake's asked about potassium levels. So he's asked, what would you consider to be high enough level of potassium? Do you use % saturation? If so, what's a high enough level to see the very high yields you're talking about?
That's a good question. I don't really deal in that in terms of what's a good level. I mean, I think we're looking at % saturation is what I typically use, and I don't know those numbers right offhand, to tell you the honest truth. But if you go to somebody like A&L's website and so on, they'll give you the maxes and the minimums on those. Now, here's the trouble with potassium. Here's the problem with blasted potassium. Potassium, your soil test will say there's lots of potassium there. It's frequently not an issue of having enough necessarily there. It's availability. So when they do the soil test, I think they take out all the potassium that's there, and a lot of that is locked up in the clay particles in between the lattices of the clay. So when it gets dry, the roots can't extract it from the plant. So that's why it's somewhat more difficult to deal with under those drought conditions. And you want to put enough on, and that's where a foliar, and we don't have a lot of we have some foliar potassium, and I know some of the guys will go in canola late in the season and put on foliar potassium. So it's just coincidental. We're looking at a new product, and I've just been doing some root work on a potassium product that's a mined potassium sulfate, not processed at all. We're sort of thinking that it might have a place in the organic market. And it's a rock. And the root hairs of canola and wheat will just dissolve that rock and extract the potassium, and along with calcium and magnesium as well. So if we can put in fertilizers that will not be tied up, so that the roots can sort of extract them over a period of time, I think that's part of the answer. And just like with nitrogen, with products like ESN and so on, that are sort of can drag out that release and tie up by the organisms, by the organic matter that's in there, maybe even some movement with water, we can stretch that availability out. It's not always the amount of volume that's there, like potassium. It's the availability of that potassium that is really somewhat critical in there. And that's why if you got good organic matter, you got a lot of water holding capacity in that soil, it will release that potassium more readily because it can be solubilized from that soil moisture there. And that's kind of the way it goes. So, the work you're doing on water I mean, we haven't got a lot of it here, and I think it's going to be really, really important as we move forward, and we're going to hopefully move our yields up over time. We basically have to, but you know, that's the key thing, is how do we make it available to the plant?
I think we have another question from Andrea. Do you want to unmute yourself, Andrea?
This is not the Andrew.
Andrea.
Andrea.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, if you just call me Andy, it could be Andrew or Andrea. It doesn't matter.
Shoot.
Yeah, you know, my question you had actually brought up there, but one that's in the chat that really interests me is you talked about some tissues and how can we trust the normal ranges from tissue testing, old tissue versus new tissue versus buds? Ranges are the same, or are the ranges not as important as the comparisons of the tissues? And I struggled with some of my guys in our advanced agronomy program this year with wanting to understand the ranges a little bit better and how that relates to yield.
I don't know if we have, well, I mean, I don't deal in that soil, you know, the lab work and the chemistry of that one there. You know, I leave that to the agronomist to figure out how to get that stuff done. I've got my hands full in trying to understand what the plant needs and what it does for it. But you're right, and even on the tissue test that we do, we're on seed. We're using the same kind of limits because we don't have them. So I noticed, I was in on Greg Patterson's phosphorus webinar yesterday, and he was implying pretty strongly that some of the old limits we have on phosphorus are probably too low to achieve, you know, maximum yields. And like I said, it's a bugger getting it to the plants, but if you're tissue testing, you know what the plants are getting. And I think we have to develop that over time. I don't think we got the great relationships to know what those tissues relate to in terms of yields in the end, personally. At least I don't. And you know, I know my limitations in terms of what I can talk about, and this is not one that I would feel I would be adequate at in terms of making that response, to tell you the honest truth. I would go to somebody who's, you know, a Greg Patterson or a Midwest Labs and so on, and see if they have any relationship on those levels. I look at mostly, if I look at them, I'm looking at that in relationship to my soil. You know, I've done some work here where I've done 0 to 3, 3 to 6, and 6 to 12. And I find it's more important to take a look at the soil test, where the nutrients are at the various levels, and then look at them relative to what's in the plant and where the roots likely are. So you got a whole bunch of issues there. And, you know, you got the crop staging. You've got some issues in terms of where the roots are feeding. If you got lots of moisture and they're feeding near the top, you're going to have a different probably uptake than if you got a whole period of dry periods that you're looking at roots being a lot deeper in terms of what those tissues really mean. The other thing you have going with potassium especially is that potassium isn't used in cell building. So the potassium circulates within the plant. It's not tied up in the actual tissue. It's used more for running processes and pushing osmotic pressure and activating enzymes, but not actually a component of those. So something like a potassium is not, you know, it's cycled through it. And if you look at plants, they will cycle in the phloem. In other words, you know, generally you say xylem up, phloem down kind of thing. But in the sugars and so on, it will be recycling that potassium as well in the plant to activate those things. So it doesn't lose a heck of a lot of potassium, but as it gets older and bigger, it has, you can dilute it out if it can't secure any more from the rooting zone. So, you know, that's a sort of a long answer to maybe not a good answer in terms of whether we can relate those tissues to the eventual yield. But it's the best we have. tell you the honest truth. It's the best we have. So if you're not in that zone and your percent potassium, your percent base saturation of potassium, even your percentage phosphorus, we're now even just on that one getting to understand what that may mean and what those levels mean. But as we move that yield higher and higher, my gut feel is we have to move those levels higher and higher because we're pulling harder and harder on the plants. And we got to get those soil levels up higher if we want to support that growth. The plant will look after tissues as best they can. And we can touch it up is about all we can do.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Your comment on relating it back to soil, I mean, that's exactly what I've been doing with customers this year, is taking the soil test, the tissue test, and then the data we get from the moisture probes to understand where our roots are, what are they doing, you know, are they in the top there pulling those nutrients, and relating all 3 data sets really together. And I'm hoping we can do some of that again this year with the same guys, same fields with their probes, and yeah, find out almost like a normal range for the farm or for the field.
That's right. And you know, the soil is such a complex mess between the different stratas, the different components, the different microbial activities that, you know, to make general statements becomes really tough. Now, I would just add one thing, which would be great. And I'm trying to launch a Western Canadian program on this. If you're doing all of that, then take some seed and do an analysis of the seed for nutrient content. Because I'm a believer that that seed will tell you what the plant couldn't get in that past growing season.
Where are you sending your seed tests for analysis, Mike? Are they going?
Sending them to A&L.
Okay, and just as the seed parts, and they'll have, yeah.
They do the plant analysis. They extract everything out of it and burn it up, and
so could you, like, are you wanting seed at full maturity? Like, does it need to
harvested?
Be harvested? Yeah.
Yeah. If you got that, you know, that quarter section or whatever, you got those probes in, just take a sample from the combine. You know, I do them. Here's another way, which is a better way to do them. If you want to get into it, I would go and hand harvest them. If he's straight cutting it, just before he's going to cut it.
Yeah, I would like to have it benchmarked
close proximity to your site.
Yeah.
Because the variability across that field is massive. We know that you can have 100% variability over a couple of bloody yards. So when you dilute that all out, you may get a false answer. So the closer you can get to it, and that's why when I do my field sampling, I do them basically in the same general area because, you know,
yeah, like, you'd either want to do a benchmark or you'd want to be almost thinking of it like a manure sample where you want to get it across a large area, a little bit across a big area to get but
I think we're gonna have for the first time a reasonable base. It's only 100 samples from across mostly Alberta and some of Manitoba through 2020, but it'll maybe give us a base. And then if we can work with seed growers or farmers who want to participate and organize it, where we can do that, the soil test, the tissue test, the seed test, and not just 1 year, but over a number of years, we may get a better handle on what does it take to produce good seed. But I'm hoping that it'll be a better use to tell the farmer what those plants could not get the year before.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm seeing. And it's just showing the same old stuff. Boron, zinc, you know, those micros. Most of the time, it's not protein. Most of the time, it's not. Calcium, I look at seed. Calcium, I go across peas, canola, wheat. The level of calcium in seed doesn't seem to vary almost at all, no matter what crop it is. There are certain nutrients that seem to be stable across the entire plant kingdom. Then there are certain nutrients that seem to have tremendous variability from crop to crop. Like I showed those peas. Those peas have always got about 3 times the amount of boron in them as wheat, which makes sense because dicots just normally just take up more boron. So over time we can make those relationships and maybe fix what we're doing out there, like fix the boron issue, fix the zinc issue, either in the seed or whatever. And we know that zinc is, Dave Hume has done work in Ontario when we were with Agritrend. If you have high levels of zinc, we get just better vigor in those plants, because zinc is the only sort of micronutrient that is in all the 6 enzyme classes that are in plants. So, you know, not all of those enzymes, but it's really key to all those activities, and including stress with copper. So some of those micros are, to me, more important. And that's why we got guys like CHACMAC and World Organization looking at biofortification of plants with zinc, because the global human population, which gets its nutrients from those plants, is showing up short of zinc. Yeah. And we can't fix it by giving everybody a pill, but we can up-regulate or put more into the plants and feed the world in a proper fashion, because we're out of balance too. Everybody's out of balance. What are we doing about COVID? We're taking vitamin D, man. Zinc and vitamin D. Go figure. We're not much different than a plant.
Yes, my supplement intakes are trying to fix some bigger problems, but we've got another question about foliars from Robert. He says, when applying foliar micros, do you need to use a carrier with it, or just add boron, zinc, manganese by itself? If so, what's best, phosphorus or nitrogen?
Oh, I think urea. I mean, this is, you know, I'm having to stick my neck out here, because this one is a tricky one, a dangerous one. I think a nitrogen one is better. The molecule, especially urea, the molecule is very small and it's not charged, so it'll move in fairly quickly and easily and drag in things along with it. Would be my guess. And you don't need generally you don't need a carrier effectively, because there should be enough solvents in there and emulsifiers in order to allow it to spread on the leaf surface and stick. Remember, it's tough to get it into a plant because the plant is covered, the cuticle is covered with waxes. About 95% of all the water lost through the plant goes through the stomata, not through any leaf surfaces, because that's dangerous. So the plant has fixed that by trying to make it almost impervious. But there are little portals that's through it. So the smaller the molecule, the better. And when I look at things like fulvic acid and humic acid, you look at the molecular sizes of those, and humics are much, much bigger molecules than fulvics. And I think fulvics in a mix are appropriate as carriers to get that into the plant. So some things like fulvic acid, I think are better as in a foliar application than they are in, say, a soil application, whereas humics are more appropriate for soils. So in terms of whether we use phosphorus or nitrogen or something else, I really would believe that nitrogen might be more appropriate as a carrier. We use it for lots of things. Phosphorus, I'm not sure about absorption of phosphorus right offhand through the cuticle itself. You know, and if you talk to Ian Evans, he says none of these work. They say a plant feeds by roots. So it is all washed off the plant and into the soil and then picked up by roots. And I think that's wrong. So we can have an argument, like you say, with somebody like Ian over that particular issue. The plants, until man came along, didn't get foliar fed. So they evolved feeding by roots, basically. But I do believe that we can get certain nutrients through in small amounts into the tissue, for sure.
So another question about potassium. For broadcast potassium, how much would you have to apply to get the amount you want available? For instance, if you apply broadcast 10 to 20 pounds per acre in season or pre-seed, I'm assuming not all of that will become available in year one, depending on conditions.
For sure not. And people are starting to broadcast potassium. We have got a stratification issue with all these immobiles, as everybody kind of knows, in a minimum zero-till situation. But because I think it's a good strategy, I personally do. It isn't the most efficient strategy, I don't think, in terms of getting it down, because it doesn't move very far. It moves further than phosphorus does once it gets into the soil and through the trash and so on. A lot of the potassium that the plant takes up, probably 85% of it stays in the roots and the chaff and the stalks. So a lot of that potassium that lays on the surfaces and isn't incorporated will have the potassium leached out of it over time with rainfall into that profile, but it can't move it down deep into that profile beyond about maybe 3 inches, but usually in the top 3 inches. I look at the stuff I'm doing here, the top 3 inches had 220 parts per million. The next 3 inches had 80. So that tells you that the potassium is not moving down worth a hoot. But by diffusion, if you keep pushing the pressure on up here, it will diffuse with water and move down over time. And because we can't put adequate amount of potassium in many cases in the seed row or the sideband, because we haven't got, potassium chloride, salt index on potassium chloride is 125 or so. It's a really salty product. So putting potassium chloride, which is a great product, in the seed row has some risks with it. So that's why it's a fairly low amount that you can put in there. You can put more in the sideband, again, with phosphorus. But as soon as you put in those massive amounts in the sidebands, you also have a salt concentration there that inhibits the roots wanting to go into that sideband. So, it's always a balancing act. So putting on the extra phosphorus over time should move it down into that rooting zone a little bit deeper. And that's one of the dilemmas we face. And the farmers in Western Canada may have to face an inevitable decision as to whether to turn that soil once every 20 years, to take all that nutrient that's trapped in that top and turn it back under and start that process again. There are some people, in fact, on yesterday's webinar, that are saying doing that every once in a blue moon isn't going to affect anything relative to, the quality of that soil and the structure and so on. I'm going to see what evolves, but I know some guys are starting to now turn soil over and mix all that nutrient into the entire profile. And in fact, if you were ever going to do that, what you probably should consider is a massive application of potassium and phosphorus before you do that.
Yeah. And
turn it in. I mean, and you may have neighbors that'll laugh at you, maybe even scorn you and not want to have coffee with you. But you know what? Do it somewhere where they can't see it and try it yourself. So you might learn a whole lot about your farming practices.
Yeah, I mean, I like the perspective too that it's not never, just because it moves slowly and a little bit, it's not that it's never.
It's not never. It does move down. And let's put it this way: the more you put on, the greater the gradient, and the faster it will move down. So here, you want something to do for, you curious guys? You can take a lawn broadcaster, just a little push one, and take a 25, 30 square foot area and go out and put on 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 pounds equivalent per acre. You can figure that all out and see what happens. Just see what happens in soil tests. I mean, you can figure some of this stuff out yourself, and it's not brain surgery as far as I'm concerned. You just got to think about it. And some of the agronomists that might be listening, this is something you guys and gals can do to find out for your clients what's going on, and turn it into a field day for your clients and so on. Those are the kind of things that we will all learn something from.
Jake has asked, what about using a minimum till deep ripper to put nutrients like K and P down to 18 inches?
Anything I don't even think you have to go that far. If you're going to deep rip due to compaction, that's another matter. If you're going to deep rip due to compaction, then yeah, you can shove nutrients down there. I never even mentioned compaction, which is an error on my part. This, to me, everywhere I go, I have a shovel. If you ever are the field day with me, you will be looking at roots. And if you go to a field day and nobody ever shows you a root, as far as I'm concerned, the field day was somewhat of a waste and poorly organized. That's just how badly I feel about roots, you know. So what was the question?
Deep ripping, 18 inches to put P and K down.
Yeah, deep ripping. Compaction, everywhere I go, I find compaction. It's just a matter of how bad it is or not. And compaction, I think, is a much more serious problem than people want to admit. It interferes with root penetration, but it also interferes with water percolation, water movement into that profile over time, leading to runoff and loss of water. Water runs downhill, and that's a problem. It accumulates salts, it leads to salinity and sodicity and those kinds of issues. So if you're deep ripping, yes, put it down there. The roots will eventually go down, but remember what I said, the roots don't necessarily want to go down any further than they have to. The other thing that'll happen, deep ripping, is you will get the roots grow down through the rip, because the roots aren't stupid. They will take the easiest route down, which are the old root channels. That's why things like alfalfa and clovers are so phenomenal, because as those roots go down and then they rot out, the actual roots of the crop have a much easier time to go down and actually penetrate it. You know, you don't even think about it, but you know, a root is going to take the easiest way down, and the root is sensing that pressure as it goes. So it's good. Yeah. So deep ripping for percolation is great idea. You got to know what you're doing. And I've heard guys talk about it. You don't want to go too deep because you can bring up lumps. You've got all kinds of other issues. So get some good advice in terms of ripping, but phenomenal. If you can figure out how to put it down 6 inches, I think that would be great. That would be huge. Take your soil test. If you get it down, you know, and you're doing a 0 to 3, 3 to 6, and so on like that, you just have to do a few. You'll soon find out. You'll soon know how far you got to get nutrients down into that soil profile to start feeding those roots that move down there. Won't take you long to figure that out. Easy peasy, man.
Beautiful. We got one last question from Robin, and I think we better wrap things up.
Quit.
Yeah. So Robin asks, most micros are less available at the high pHs.
Right.
Does the plant have any adaptations to deal with pH? Do we need to apply higher rates of micros at higher pH?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, I would say especially phosphorus, put on higher rates, and probably most everything. You're right, because it gets tied up. But here's a dilemma you face. I may have to take that back. As you put on more, if you've got enough bicarbonate there to suck it up, it doesn't help you. It just ties up more. Now, where you may work, if it's that bad, your carbonates are that bad, and say your calcium above, free calcium above 7.5 is high, it's going to tie up. So there is a place where foliar applications may be your answer, because you take the soil out of the equation. What we need are things like, and I like things like mez, for example, which can release nutrients over a period of time. And that's one of the benefits of our crystal green, besides being recovered phosphorus. The phosphorus in the granules is released by the exudates from the roots, so you don't get it all tied up by the interaction of all the calcium, magnesium, and so on. Now, contrary to listening to Greg Pattison yesterday, and something I believed is that everybody talks about potassium being tied up by calcium at those high pHs. He doesn't seem to feel that until you get past maybe 8.1, 8.2, that calcium phosphorus binding site, he thinks the plants can extract that, and I'm sort of a believer of that as well, because especially that canola plant, the root exudates, we'll go up here, in that rhizosphere around the root can adjust the pH by at least 1 point in that root rhizosphere, which is really small. It's the area that the actual root hairs can occupy. So it can control that pH pretty closely. And it also, by doing that pH adjustment, it controls the microbial life in that rhizosphere, which is the key part in terms of those organisms extracting phosphorus and breaking it down from the microbes and everything that contain that phosphorus in the sort of organic phase. And then the root hairs can pick it up. You know, as that root tip goes through the ground, it leaves sugars behind on the root cap, and microorganisms can live in there. And I'm a believer that we'll eventually find out that canola has different exudates and so on that can control that. So when we get that, we don't have to worry about breaking that calcium bond, is what he's saying. It is fairly readily. He says the magnesium one is a tougher one to break, in his opinion, as I was listening to that webinar. And I kind of thought that yesterday, but there's one other important point that is just slipping my mind. IDC, for you guys that are soybean growers. You know that that high pH and high free calcium can be an issue for soybeans, because soybeans can't acidify the rhizosphere nearly as well. So when we have high calcium available, carbonates available, and water is pulled into the roots, that calcium accumulates on the exterior of the root, and the plant can't produce enough acids to bring that pH down, and it can extract iron. So that's why you got iron deficiency chlorosis in soybeans. And that's why now we have soybean varieties that have been selected that can do that. And now the newer varieties will tell you that it has that quality. So genetics can change some of that through selection of varieties. And one thing you should think about is when you're buying seed, if you're living in northern Saskatchewan, for example, and you're buying seed from southern Saskatchewan, varieties may be of importance depending on the differences in terms of, the breeding history of that, what the capabilities are. And it may not be suited for your area. It may be a high yielder, but it may not be suited for your area because of where it was bred and what the results, in yields were in that particular habitat. So consider that. Sometimes, you might be in a better position to buy it from the seed grower down the road than somewhere far away that was growing that. For example, if you were growing, if you were a zinc deficient and you were buying something from a zinc deficient area, and you put it into another zinc deficient area to grow, that's kind of a problem. If you got a lot of zinc in your area, for example, like Northern Peace has a lot of zinc in the soil naturally, just naturally there, then you could take that seed and it would do just fine and dandy. So it's considered some of those kinds of things in terms of going forward. And that's why I think the seed industry is interested in looking at the nutrient density in the seed finally, so that we can take a look at your soil test and say, oh man, my seed has got lots of this in it. I noticed your soil test over here says, you're kind of deficient in this nutrient. I think this is a good match. This seed should go in there. Or no, it shouldn't do. It should go somewhere else. I mean, hopefully we'll get there someday. In the United States, corn varieties and so on, man, they got that nailed down to what your pH is. And like, they know exactly which variety goes where. We haven't even, seems like, approached that. It amazes me. I hope it was entertaining, if not useful, and everybody learned something out of this. I live for this kind of stuff, and I hope to keep doing it. And one day I want to put on a whole day webinar, or not a live one day, a training session for farmers and young farmers, and looking at a father-son kind of concept where they come together at this one event and we talk about growing crops together, because there can be a lot of friction, from what I understand, between fathers and sons in terms of deciding what to do. And I think by talking about plants and soils in this fashion, bring in some people, would be a lot of fun.
That sounds like a great idea. I think there is so much of that. The challenges of making those decisions effectively when there's two really different schools of thought coming together. And I think we've all seen it to some extent, and I'm sure lots on the call have lived through it. So
and I'll finish with one thought. You don't, and you shouldn't cross this river in one jump. You don't have to fix everything in 1 year or even 2 years. You're going to be on this farm, and if the farm is in the family, it's going to be there a long time. Work slowly, start with one field, try things that aren't going to be at high risk, and move forward and learn for yourself. Get the best advice you can. Learn as much as you can. Read. There's lots to read now with internet. You can go on and you can call up just about anything you want, and you can find out for yourself. Spend some time reading a little bit every day, or during the wintertime, nothing else to do. Don't watch curling. What the heck? That's not very much fun. And I don't even think they're curling anymore. So that's my secret. Try something, be in the field, do some testing. If you don't, just take one field and do it. You'll learn more about your crop than you ever wanted to know. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Mike. I've certainly learned lots from you today and the last couple of days here. So we'll do it again soon.
You bet. Take care. Good luck this summer.
Thank you.
You bet. We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.